my darlings, I'm Carmen Dark, and welcome to Tormented Tales, where we share stories that are both truly terrifying and terrifyingly true. A quick reminder before we begin tonight's journey into the darker places to hit that subscribe button to ensure that you don't miss out on any of our future collections. And as always, if you'd like to submit your own true tale of terror for us to read out, send them along to the address in the description below. Tonight's true tales concern what would usually be a simple and innocuous object, one which some of you may well be using at this precise moment: the telephone. There's just something about it, isn't there? That moment when it rings, calling to bring a new connection into life. Those few split seconds not knowing who is calling you or why. Good news or bad? Friend or stranger? Our first story comes from Abigail in England and concerns a simple game that I would encourage viewers not to try at home. The Dead Dial Game. The whole thing with the phone started out as a game. More of a dare, really. One of those games that comes with a story attached, you know? There are tons of these sorts of games out there. They're really more like urban legends than actual games, because 9 times out of 10 people tell the story about how someone else played the game and get so scared that they never actually get around to playing it themselves. Basically, dare games are the sorts of things that teenagers play at sleepovers or house parties when their parents are away. They're meant for kids to frighten and tease each other. I remember when I was at school, people would talk about saying Candyman or Bloody Mary into a mirror 5 times. Or they'd go on about how you could play a game in a lift. The idea being that if you pressed the numbers in a certain order or code, the lift would take you to a hidden floor. Some people talked about doing Ouija boards or playing the Scrabble game to talk to dead people and spirits. For us, though, it was always the Dead Dial game. For those of you who've never heard of it, the idea of the Dead Dial is actually quite simple. You take the first 2 numbers of your phone number and write it down on a scrap of paper. This was in the days before mobile phones, so you had to make sure you either had access to your landline or had one of those portable handsets and could smuggle it away. Then, you'd take 10 counters and write the numbers 1 to 9 plus a 0 onto them. What you used as counters wasn't important. It could be scraps of cardboard, buttons, marbles, dried beans, or checkers, as long as they were all the same size, and you would have no way of knowing which was which when you drew them out at random. I remember me and my friends used to use a roll of extra strong mints because they were these little white disc-like draughts and all of the same size. You got 12 in a packet, so we'd put 2 aside and carefully printed the numbers 1 to 9 and a 0 onto them with a Sharpie. The smell of mint still makes my stomach turn over to this day. We'd put the mints into a little paper bag and then draw the numbers out at random. Each time you drew one out, you would put the counter back into the bag so that you had the chance of getting repeated numbers. Every time you drew a number, you would also write it down, so that eventually you had a totally randomized number. Then, with all your friends giggling and egging you on, you would punch the numbers into your own phone and call it. Before you pressed call, you would show everyone the number so they knew you weren't cheating and just dialing someone you knew. Then, you would say the words, "Night Black, Rose Reed, calling back to hear the dead." Then, you'd press call. Most times the call would last less than a few seconds, mostly because my friends and I would immediately chicken out. As soon as someone picked up and answered, my girlfriends and I would screech in terror and hang up the phone, laughing hysterically half from fear and half from amusement. To the person on the other end, it was essentially just a prank call or an inconvenience. The myth behind the game was that by randomizing the number, you could find one that gave you a line to a dead person, someone who had recently passed or a spirit depending on who was telling the story. It was stupid, juvenile, and I have to admit, a lot of fun. Until the last time we did it. Then suddenly, the fun just stopped. We were all around at my friend Claire's house. Her parents were away for the weekend, and she had been allowed to have friends over on the Saturday night. In theory, she was supposed to be in the care of her elder sister Tina, but she had snuck out with her boyfriend for the evening, leaving us, a group of 12-year-old girls, alone for the night. Tina would trust us to behave and be alone as long as we promised not to tell that she went out and stayed over at her boyfriend's house. Of course we agreed, because at that age, this was about the most exciting thing that had ever happened. After a few hours talking over the top of movies and eating pizza, we started teasing each other and eventually got around to the idea of playing the dead dial game. Claire brought her phone up to the room, and I carefully scrawled the numbers onto the mints. We put them in a bag, drew them out one by one, and created a number to call. Since it was Claire's house, not to mention her phone, I had expected her to be the one to call. But the others all nominated me to do it. I was a little reluctant at first, but it had been funny every other time we'd played, so I said why not? I recited the little poem or prayer or whatever it was, punched in the numbers, and used the fancy button on Claire's handset to put the call on loudspeaker so everyone could hear. I also decided that this time, I wasn't going to hang up straight away. As we all sat cross-legged in a circle on the floor, I placed the handset in the middle and pressed call. After a few seconds, the phone began to ring. We shared hushed, excited glances and tried our best not to laugh. Then, there was a click, and someone answered.
"Hello, Abigail,"
said a man's voice in a low, even tone. I felt as if someone had punched me in the gut. How could he know my name? It wasn't my phone. It wasn't even my house. And we had drawn the numbers completely at random.
"I hope you and your friends are having fun."
I stared at the others. For the first time playing this game, none of us were laughing. "Who?" I started nervously. "Who are you? How do you know my name?"
"You should know who I am,"
said the voice.
"After all, you called me. If I come round to visit you, if I come round right now, then can I have one of your mints? I find they go so well with the salty taste of skin."
I picked up the phone and threw it. It crashed against the wall as the plastic cover splintered, and the machine's wires and workings hung through the hole like the bowels of a butchered animal. We did not sleep at all that night. Instead, we clung to each other, flinching and screaming at every tiny sound. When Tina came back the following morning, she found us huddled together in the corner of the room, exhausted, tearful and terrified, the remnants of a broken phone lying by our feet. I never played the game again, and I still hate the smell of mint. As I said, not one to try for yourself. You see, the problem with calling into the darkness is that you never know who might answer. In our next story, however, submitted by Rose from California, it isn't the question of who will answer that is of concern, but rather who it is that might be calling. Who would make those calls in the middle of the night, calls with such dire consequences on what the inmates refer to as the fourth phone. The fourth phone. It's funny to see how stories take root, how little superstitions, sprouting from a single seed of doubt, can go on to grow into the great gardens of myth, how a single suggestion or idea planted deep in a fertile imagination can become a tangled vine of rumors and words, ready to coil and wrap around the center of our minds. It happens everywhere, but especially in places where the same people come together often, where they share the flakes of stories and build up the details in tiny layers of myth. I've seen it happen with my own eyes, though to be fair, the process was probably accelerated by the fact that these particular people had no choice but to come together often. They also had a lot of time for those rumors and details to play upon their minds. I've been a corrections officer, or prison guard if you prefer, for the better part of 15 years now. Apart from a short stint down south during my training year, I've spent every shift of that 15 years at the same institution, overseeing inmates, managing their tantrums and transfers, sweeping cells and enforcing lockdowns, day in and day out for almost a decade and a half. As a woman, the job can have its difficulties. Though I learned a long time ago that with most inmates, showing for even an instant that you're intimidated is to lose the battle before it even starts. That counts for the relationship between guards and inmates, and also for the relationship between prisoners. Inmates go to great lengths, posturing and establishing the pecking order to make sure they get the respect they feel they deserve and don't become the victims of others. It is important to seem unafraid, which, of course, made it all the weirder that the inmates would show such fear of something as simple as a telephone. On the lower floor of the prison next to the mess hall and across from the canteen area, there were 4 phones attached to the far wall. Prisoners were given phone cards at the start of each week with a number of minutes they could use to call people on the outside. Whether they spent those minutes on calling their lawyers or family was up to them. But whatever they did, they had to do it in public, standing by that far wall. The rules and pecking order over who got to use the phone first and how long each inmate could spend on the set was a careful balance that depended upon seniority, respect, and status. Sometimes a more dominant inmate would steal the minutes of a weaker prisoner. Sometimes a call would be cut short because a big player wanted to use the phone. Often, there was a queue to use the phones, and the whole area was a flashpoint for disagreements that had to be managed carefully. What made the situation worse was that despite there being 4 phones attached to the wall, only 3 were ever used. The 4th set, though it was clean, intact, and as far as we knew worked perfectly, never had its receiver lifted. In fact, inmates speaking on the phone next to the 4th phone would turn their backs to it and stand as far away as possible from the machine. I've literally seen fights break out when the guy on phone 3 got too close to the guy on phone 2 because he didn't want to be near the 4th phone. In the 15 years I've worked at the prison, I have never once seen any inmate use that phone. How the story is spread, who tells who, and exactly what the reason is, I don't know. But the inmates would rather queue for an hour than touch that thing. It's as if on the day they arrive, they're briefed. You might get shanked, you might get a beating, or even worse if you step out of line. But whatever you do not use that phone. I've never seen it used, but I have heard it ring. So far in 15 years, I've heard it 6 times. On every occasion, the call came at night. On every occasion, it turned what had been a chorus of hollering shouts and curses into absolute quiet. For a few moments, there'd be hushed whispers. "The 4th phone's ringing," hissed between cells in a frightened panic. Then, silence. As the phone continued to ring and ring and ring. Nobody, not the inmates nor the guards, were prepared to answer. I've heard the phone 6 times. I know from my colleagues that it had been heard another 4 times, and on every occasion, the following morning one inmate turns up dead, choked on their tongue, did it to themselves, or simply expired from a heart attack or an aneurysm. Alive before the call, dead by the time it stops. The inmates know this, and every time the phone rings, they fall into a hush. One of them, they know, won't be there by morning. Some might ask why we don't just take the thing out, cut the line, or have the thing removed altogether. There are 2 answers to that. The first is that one of the wardens claimed to have already done it. According to him, the line was cut and physically severed 3 months before it next began to ring. I haven't actually checked that, for reasons relating to the second answer. We're scared too. You have to remember, we spend a lot of time with these people in this place. And whilst I'm not saying I necessarily believe the myth of the fourth phone, I don't entirely disbelieve it either. Like I said at the start, it's funny to see how stories take root. That's all for this edition, kiddies. Be sure to subscribe and tune in next time for more examples of truth being both stranger and more terrifying than fiction. Until then, you'll have to excuse me. I think I hear the telephone ringing. Sweet dreams.